from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And our featured guest during the first part of the broadcast, K-State's Jeff Whitworth. He'll provide a full update on insect activity in soybean and grain sorghum stands around Kansas. He'll talk about aphids in beans, saying that you producers can likely get away with not treating those. He also has the latest on the sugarcane aphid threat to sorghum, and Jeff looks at the most concerning problem at the moment, headworms and fall armyworms feeding on sorghum heads, and a couple of new insecticide products for contending with those. Also today, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Ward Upham will cover the guidelines for harvesting homegrown apples and pears. Plus more ahead on this Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're tuned to Agriculture Today, and glad to have you aboard once again. And we'll spend some extra time today addressing relatively late season insect activity in our soybeans and grain sorghum around Kansas. And a bit later in this conversation, we'll tell you about 2 new treatments against a couple of primary pests in grain sorghum. Joining us once again is Jeff Whitworth, crop entomologist, K-State Research and Extension. As a starting point, though, an update on bugs in soybeans. That's a pretty quiet scene, you say, Jeff.
Yes. Good morning, Eric. So far, you don't want to get too carried away, right, because we are double crop beans are just into the early reproductive stages. Things are really looking good insect wise, and by that I mean there are not that many defoliators out there. There are defoliators. I still get questions about should I treat or not, but right now, at least, I've not seen enough defoliators, even as a complex, to worry about. Now, that doesn't mean in the next 2 to 3 weeks there won't be considerably more come on, but I really don't think so, because in most of the cases we have good canopies established. We got good projected weather conditions, at least, for growing. So I really don't think the defoliators are going to amount to much, with one maybe exception, and that's soybean aphids. The soybean aphid continues to migrate into Kansas. They have every year since 2002. That was the first year we actually found soybean aphids in Kansas. And since 2002, I think maybe we've only had to treat them maybe twice, 2 different years in those, 17 years since they've been migrating into Kansas. But they can build up really quick because they are an aphid. As you know, aphids reproduce parthenogenically, therefore they don't have to, waste time looking for a mate or waste time laying eggs or waiting for eggs to hatch. They just reproduce females, and those females produce females, and so they can produce populations very quickly. Fortunately, there's quite a few beneficials out there right now in the soybean fields, so I really don't think they're going to be a problem. Plus, temperatures, if temperatures are much over 85 degrees, they're not conducive to soybean aphids populations increasing, and I think that's part of the reason we haven't had problems with them over the years, because our August, September temperatures are usually, over 85 degrees. Mm-hmm. But this year has been a little different. We've had a little cooler temperatures, at least in August. Projected maybe going to warm up a little bit, but just caution everybody to keep their eyes open for soybean aphids. Again, we have pretty good canopies established, but as these beans start going into the reproductive phases, if we do get big populations of aphids, they can suck some of the juice out of the plants pretty quickly. So just monitor the situation.
Stay on top of it, but don't react yet, because there's no need to do so. On the other hand, there are more than a few pests getting after it in grain sorghum, you say.
Sorghum is really, right now, the focal point for the insect pests. First of all, we have what I would consider an abnormally large population of cattail caterpillars. Cattail caterpillars, we have them every year. Usually they appear about in the whorl stage, so usually it's about a month earlier than it has been this year. But this year, right now, mid to late August, there are serious populations of cattail caterpillars, and I'm getting a lot of calls about them because they are pretty good defoliators. They chew big holes in leaves, or they strip leaves pretty visually, so when the growers go out there, they notice them. Now, cattail caterpillars will feed on any grass. So when you walk into the field, I've seen them all over the brome, but they're really in the sorghum, and they really are causing these big concern to the growers because of their defoliation. However, again, if it's in the whorl stage or the boot stage or past that, I really wouldn't recommend treating for a defoliator because we've just never been able to show any yield reductions due to this defoliation. And most of the cattail caterpillars that I've seen, they're only going to be feeding for about another week, if that. Most of them are pretty far along in their developmental stage, and I don't think we're going to get another generation of them. We're getting on towards September, and we usually have 2 generations a year, so I don't think we'll have another one at this late stage. But they are causing considerable concern just because they're big, they're really showy, they're highly visible, they're kind of what I think a neat caterpillar because they're very furry, red, orange, black, white colors, and people see them as they just start to walk into a sorghum field. And they get all over you. As you walk through there, you brush off, so the growers are really noticing them. But I really don't think it's going to be anything to worry about just as far as defoliation goes. And I've never seen them move to the head to feed on the marketable product or the grain. Now, once in a while, you'll see one in the head, but by and large, they're feeding on the foliage.
They're not like this other pest we'll bring up in just a second. But before we get to it, sugarcane aphids, any update on those?
Yes, we continue to get sugarcane aphids into Kansas. I've not heard of any treatable populations yet. That can change at any time. But I talked to some of the guys down in Texas. There are treatable large populations around Lubbock into Amarillo area, which is, as most folks know, it's just across the border into Texas from Oklahoma. And as we get southern breezes or southern winds, more of these aphids are going to continue to come in as they have in the last couple of years. However, the last couple of years, for whatever reason, and I mainly attribute it to the number of beneficials that are around, i.e. the lacewings and the lady beetles and the little wasps and the syrphid flies, they have not established. Even though when you're out in a sorghum field, you keep getting bombarded by the adult aphids, and you can find them on the plants, but they don't seem to be able to colonize like they did back in 2015 and 2016. So hopefully that'll be the way it is this year. But just bear in mind, they're still migrating in, and they can still create havoc towards harvest time, even if they come in after the grain's filled, because of the amount of honeydew they produce and the stickiness of that honeydew. So just keep in mind that we need to continue to monitor for sugarcane aphids probably for the next month.
Duly noted. But the one that grain sorghum growers should hone in on now is called the sorghum headworm, also known as the corn earworm, the soybean podworm, as you've told us numerous times, one and the same pest. And you say it's out there in sufficient numbers, right?
Yes, there are numerous headworms in the sorghum. And I've been looking for the last 7 to 10 days in a lot of fields throughout south central and north central Kansas. South central Kansas, it's getting a little further along, but north central Kansas, we have a considerable amount of sorghum that's just getting into the boot stage and just getting to where it's going to start heading. So you're going to start seeing more and more headworms also as the heads become available. The headworms, they are affecting sorghum between flowering and soft dough. They can affect it after soft dough if the worms are already there feeding, but the worms actually, when they're small, they can't feed on the grain once it gets to soft dough. Now, if they're already there and they're large, they can complete their development for 3 or 4 days on soft dough. But for the most part, if you notice the worms are large, don't treat is what I'm trying to say. So anytime you treat for headworms or any other insect, timing is critical. Timing is very important. So you need to get out and just, until you start seeing the flowering of the little yellow flowers on the heads, they're not going to be affecting the head that much. But once they start to flower, once the heads start to flower, those moths will start being attracted to the field and they'll start laying eggs in the heads. So that's the time when you need to get out. And the best method that I've found is just to use a little white 1-gallon ice cream bucket and walk in the field and vigorously shake the head into the bucket. Do that in 4 or 5 different places, 10, 15, 20 heads, and then count the number of worms you have and remember how many heads you did that for. The treatment threshold for headworms, and by headworms I'm talking, like you said, either corn earworm, fall armyworm, or true armyworm. It doesn't matter. They all do about the same, and that's about 5% damage per worm per head. So we don't have a treatment threshold of 1 worm per row foot or like we do for some of the other crops. It's 5% damage per worm per head. So it's kind of easy to figure. If you go out and you sample 100 heads, you got 50 worms, you figure that's 50% infestation. So you're going to lose 2.5%, right, of that. So then you figure out what your targeted bushel per acre is. That kind of gives you an idea of what it would cost if you didn't treat the worms. So that's the way that works. It's really pretty simple. So you need to get out and you need to detect these populations while they're really small. One of the problems with that is if you're out and you're vigorously shaking each head into a white bucket, off that head you're getting all kinds of stuff. You're getting pollen and flowerets and all kinds of stuff. And these little small worms are very well camouflaged. So what I do is I just do 5 or 6 plants and then I sit there and look in there first because I generally have to see them move before I can detect the worm because they're really – and that's what you want to do. You want to detect them when they're small. Once they get a little bit larger, they're easy to see. But what you want to do is get out there and figure out what the population is while it's small. But remember, those moths are going to continue to lay eggs there for another week or 7 or 8 days, depending upon what stage that head is in right there.
All right. Well, Jeff, we need to step aside for a couple of minutes. We will return then with K-State's Jeff Whitworth and talk about insecticide responses to those headworms in grain sorghum. This is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. Agriculture Today continues now here on the K-State Radio Network, and picking back up on timely row crop insect management with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth, Mike's side. So we addressed the soybean aphid concerns in soybeans, or the lack thereof, thankfully, as well as the need to remain vigilant against a potential late push of sugarcane aphids in sorghum. But where we left off before the break, Jeff, discussing the magnitude of headworm activity in grain sorghum around Kansas currently, to the point that growers should seriously consider treating those if they have reached or exceeded that threshold you mentioned. Again, sampling 15 to 20 sorghum heads in a field, shaking those into a white bucket, counting the sorghum headworms and the fall armyworms that turn up. The going rate, if you will, 5% grain loss per worm per head. And then a producer would factor in their expected yield and figure out whether an insecticide treatment would pay off. As far as product selection, there are several that have been around a while at the producer's disposal, but there are 2 new entries into that lineup, you tell us. What about those?
Yes, the synthetic organic insecticides that we've used for a considerable time, they're still widely used. We still think they're perfectly good to use. One of the problems with the general insecticides is they kill all the insects they come in contact with. They are contact insecticides. So they're going to kill the worms that you're intending as the target, but they're also going to kill the beneficials. They'll kill the sugarcane aphid if the aphids are there, if it gets in contact with it. But one of the problems with the aphids, most of the aphid colonies are on the underneath side of a leaf, and they're usually in the mid part of the plant, so they're sheltered by the upper leaves, so you don't get a good contact with the insecticide, with the aphids, but you do with the beneficials, because the beneficials are flying all around or crawling all around looking for food, so they have a better chance of coming in contact with the insecticide. And the aphids reproduce parthenogenically, just like the soybean aphids do. So those colonies can just explode relatively quickly because there aren't any beneficials there to hinder them or to help control them. So once the activity wears off in the insecticides, these aphids, plus are continuing to migrate in, those colonies can just explode without any beneficials there to slow them down. Yeah, you've killed the headworms, and you've killed a few of the aphids, but you haven't solved the problem later on of the secondary pests with the sugarcane aphids that explode. We've seen that in the last, not the last 2 years, but in 2015 and 2016. Fortunately, as you said, there's a couple of products that are virus-related compounds.
And these are specifically targeted to
They are, yes,
the worms.
they are targeted just to corn earworms, and that product is called heligen, or fall armyworms, and that product is called phologen. And that brings up the point that you need to really get out and determine which species you have early on. Really, the fall armyworm's easy to determine because they'll have 4 little spots on the last abdominal segment of the larva. If they're really small, which I'm hoping that's where you detect them early on, you might have to look at them under magnification. Or the corn earworm, they'll have little tiny hairs coming from them. So really, if you look at them under 10-power magnification, you can tell them apart. But if you're not sure or you don't want to do that, you can combine these two products together, the heligen plus the phologen, and they're tank mix compatible, so you can use them both and be relatively sure that you're going to have a good application. Now, one of the problems with this, it is a virus. Viruses are relatively sensitive to sunlight. So if you spray it and it's cloudy, you're going to have longer residual activity than if you spray it and the sun's shining. Some of the people I've talked to said after about 24 hours, the virus will break down. So that's what I remember what I said, timing is critical. Well, with these two products, it's really critical. Number one, it's not a contact insecticide. They have to be ingested, or the insects have to pick them up. And after they do that, it takes 2 or 3 days before it actually affects the insect. You know, it's kind of like when we get a cold, you start feeling it coming on, but it doesn't affect you for 24, 36 hours. It's exactly the same with the worms. So you need to get out and detect them when they're small. You need to apply it when it's early on while they're still small, because it takes 2 or 3 days before it affects them. Now, once you get it established, the next wave of eggs and worms, there should be enough virus around to continue to protect those plants throughout the period of time when the moths are laying eggs. Up until
there's residual activity.
So there's yes, it's transferred from worm to worm, or there's some indications that if you get rain, the raindrops will spread the virus and that kind of stuff. So once you get a good epizootic, it's called, established, you get a bunch of dead worms out there, you should be protected until the soft dough stage, which is the susceptible stage of the sorghum. Now, there's a couple problems with this. Number one, it's not a contact insecticide, so you have to make sure you get good coverage. Mm-hmm. You should make sure of that with anything. The more carrier you use, the better off you are. Generally speaking, if you're going by air, we recommend at least 3 gallons per acre. If you're going by ground, at least 10, 15 would be better, gallons per acre. But again, that's an individual call, but that's you got to get good coverage on these things. So sunlight's important. If you buy the product and you have a sealed container, you don't want to keep it in the cab of your truck because it gets too hot, so you want to keep it below 95 degrees.
Or it'll wipe out the virus.
Or it will kill the virus. It'll render it inactive. Yeah. Matter of fact, virus containers that are sealed should not be exposed to direct sunlight for more than 2 hours, or in temperatures over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. That's in transporting it to the field or to the wherever it is you're going to mix the product.
So one has to be really careful here. It would be quite easy for one to put that in the back of the truck or, like you say, in the cab, and it would overheat fast.
Very quickly so, and for 2 hours, that's not very long when you're stopped for lunch or something. So just keep that in mind. Less than 95 degrees or not in the direct sunlight for less than 2 hours. And like I said, in the mixing, you want to make sure once you mix it, you get it applied pretty quickly, more so than the regular insecticides. Also, the water you use, it needs to be below or equal to a pH of 8. It needs to be more acidic, or basically, if it could be neutral, that'd be good. But if it's more basic, if it's over 8, you need to do something to bring that down, because again, that will deactivate the virus a little bit. So there's some handling issues with the virus, but it is an alternative, and apparently it's not effective on anything other than those targets, the headworm complex consisting of corn earworms or fall armyworms. Now, we do have some regular armyworms, true armyworms out there, but so far what I've seen, it's corn earworms or fall armyworms. There haven't been any armyworms. Could be, and this should affect a certain proportion of them, but not as much as it will the corn earworm or the fall armyworm, because that's what it's targeted to do. So these products were around last year. A lot of guys tried them. What I always suggest is try it. See if you like it. It's going to protect all the other beneficials in case we do get sugarcane aphids later on. So it will allow the beneficials to help control sugarcane aphids, so maybe you don't have to treat for those. But I'm not sure we'll have sugarcane aphid populations at treatment levels yet. That remains to be seen. This is just an alternative which will help protect some of the non-target organisms in your field. And from what I've heard, now I'm not seeing it, we have some plots out this year that maybe we'll get some data for, but I've heard a lot of testimonials that it works pretty good. But again, the conditions have to be just right. You have to get it on just at the right time. If you don't, the longer you wait to treat with any product, those worms are feeding 24/7.
Right.
So they're feeding on the marketable product. So they're out there on that head feeding on those berries 24/7 until you actually stop them with some sort of a treatment.
So this really is, in closing, a call to action to grain sorghum growers to check for the fall armyworms or the sorghum headworms, see if they're out there, and react without much delay.
Yes, and like I said, a lot of the sorghum is just getting to that point where it's going to be susceptible. And from what I saw in the corn, from what I've seen in the last week or so, the corn earworm populations are really pretty high right now.
All right. Well, we appreciate the word on this, Jeff, including the overview of these two new alternatives for controlling those headworm problems in grain sorghum, and we will likely have you back at least one more time before this growing season wraps up. Appreciate it as always. Many thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you, Eric.
That's a word for you soybean and particularly you grain sorghum growers on managing insect issues in your stands at present. That's Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, a crop entomologist with K-State Research and Extension. We've still more for you on this Agriculture Today. When we return, today's agricultural news headlines in review. Also, Greg Akagi awaits with this week's edition of the Kansas Soybean Update. And once more, we'll talk homegrown apple and pear harvest with K-State's Ward Upham during our weekly horticulture segment. All of that yet to come here on the K-State Radio Network. Please keep it right here.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Now, today's agricultural news headlines in brief for you, courtesy in part of DTN. The USDA will investigate reports of possible market manipulation following that fire that badly damaged the Tyson beef plant in Holcomb earlier this month. In the days following the plant fire, live cattle futures moved limit lower, and that added, of course, strong pressure to cash cattle trade. In a press statement yesterday, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue said that the USDA will examine the market concerns. Quoting him, "I have directed USDA's Packers and Stockyards Division to launch an investigation into recent beef pricing margins to determine if there's any evidence of price manipulation, collusion, restrictions of competition, or other unfair practices." The Secretary went on to say, "If any unfair practices are detected, we will take quick enforcement action." Now, the Tyson plant harvested 5,600 head per week, equal to about 6% of the nation's beef packing capacity. Boxed beef values surged on the idea that packers would not be able to deliver enough meat to the market following that fire. Boxed beef values rising $22 per hundredweight in choice cuts. National Cattlemen's Beef Association President Jennifer Houston said in a news release that it was welcome to see USDA's reaction to market concerns. And federal lawmakers have called on the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, or the CFTC, to monitor cattle markets following the Tyson fire. President Trump will soon announce a plan to mitigate the effects of EPA's small refinery exemptions to the renewable fuel standard. That's according to USDA Secretary Perdue. Speaking yesterday at the Farm Progress Show in Illinois, the Secretary said that the president is expected to plan a Midwest trip soon, though no date is set, and will announce then how the administration will offset the 31 refinery exemptions granted by the EPA earlier this month. Perdue noted that the president has authorized year-round sales of E15. There's an opportunity, potentially, he says, to grow demand for ethanol blends from E10 by as much as 50%. Going from E10 to E15 everywhere, said the Secretary, would increase demand for corn by 2 billion bushels. Small refinery waivers came up repeatedly in the listening session at the Farm Progress Show yesterday from farmers and folks in the ethanol and biodiesel industry. Perdue said, quoting here, "The president understood that was way overdone, and we are meeting furiously to try to recover some of that demand destruction that those small refinery waivers did." He said we have to be very creative legally in order to do that. And he added that the president's eventual announcement has been delicately crafted and will provide some relief. Meantime, the Secretary had some candid thoughts yesterday on progress in reaching a U.S.-China trade deal. The USDA's Stephanie Ho has more.
Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue says the ball is in China's court regarding reaching a trade deal.
The question is what's China going to do to stop stealing our stuff? Maybe you'd like to ask China, President Xi, what China's going to do to come to the table and trade like a number 2 economy in the world and trade fairly, freely, without hassling and jerking our producers around.
He spoke to reporters on the sidelines of an ag policy summit in Illinois.
And while we've become dependent on China as a consumer, we've become dependent on somebody who's not playing by the rules.
USDA is enacting the second consecutive year of a multi-billion-dollar aid program aimed at mitigating farmers' trade losses.
The president's the one that called me when the talks broke down for China. We were at 90% there with China when Xi walked away from that, backtracked on those agreements that had already been agreed to, and started reneging on that. That's when the president called me and said, "Sonny, we're going to need another program." And we're not anticipating one for 2020.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
On the calendar, want to remind you of more of those water technology farm field days coming up next week. As a matter of fact, 3 of those, these co-sponsored by the Kansas Water Office and K-State Research and Extension. One set for this coming Wednesday, September the 4th, near Goodland. Then September the 5th, Thursday, near Garden City in that area. And also on September the 5th, in the Liberal area, there'll be another one in northeast Kansas near Troy on September the 10th. For more particulars on those, you can go to kwo.org, kwo.org. On we go now to this week's Kansas soybean update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Natalie Harris, a junior at Kansas State University. She is from Abilene, joins us, and she was one of the interns with Kansas Soybeans this summer. And Natalie, what were some of your duties serving with the Kansas Soybeans this summer as an intern?
Well, I worked really heavily with the social media pages, coming up with content to promote the different byproducts and uses of soybeans in consumers' everyday life, and really interacting with consumers and influencers through those pages, and then also putting together some of our bigger projects like our congressional report, coordinating with my fellow intern, coordinating some stuff for our tour, and then attending Camp Biodiesel.
I'm sure that interaction was fun, not only via social media, but just talking with with soybean growers across the state.
Yes, no, it was a lot of fun getting to interact, especially with some either commodity groups or different organizations that are also on social media, and getting to kind of banter back and forth and promote our product. What
kind of message on social media did you try to portray or try to get out there to consumers?
I just tried to get it out there that there's, soy in a lot of different products. And so, even some things that they might not even realize contain soy, and just really pushing the fact that it's sustainable and it's good for us.
As far as the interaction, looking at the congressional report, you kind of see some of the inner workings of what the soybean industry does to get that message not only to consumers but to Congress as well.
Yep. It was definitely one thing that I really enjoyed about this summer was getting to see all of that statistical data. I grew up on a farm, so, you see one side of an operation, but being able to really see the whole impact of agriculture in the state of Kansas was a really awesome thing to put together.
What would you like to do in the future?
For sure, want to stay within the agriculture industry and work around people, getting to either talk to farmers, producers, or even just consumers.
If others are interested in an internship like this, what makes this so inviting to become an intern with Kansas Soybeans?
I think it's a really great experience. I definitely looked forward to this summer at the beginning of summer, and it was really good. I would definitely encourage anyone who's wanting to intern with Kansas Soybean to definitely, take a chance on it, and you'll get to work with a lot of great people and just get to promote agriculture.
Natalie, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
That's Natalie Harris from Abilene, who will be a junior at Kansas State University. She joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Greg Akagi there. Thanks, Greg. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
For you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly K-State horticulture segment. And this time around, geared toward those of you who raise apples and pears in your home gardening activities. Ward Upham is along with us once again, horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. Now, harvesting either of these fruits, there's a technique that folks should follow, and they're not the same. As far as apple ripeness, there's no standard calendar to go by, you say, Ward.
There really isn't, because there's so much variability among different varieties of apples. For example, Lodi is a green apple that'll get ripened, probably about July sometime. And something like Arkansas Black, it may not be ripe until really in early November. And even then, it actually needs an after ripening period. You need to let it sit for about a month after you've picked it before it really starts to taste good.
So step one might be check the lineage of your apple to see exactly when to expect it to ripen.
That's right. So if you look in the fruit catalog, they'll often list the month that it's expected to get ripe. Now, that may vary some depending on the weather and where you are in relationship to where that tree was grown. But at least it gives you an idea. It gives you somewhere to start with. From then on, just make up your own database where you keep track of when it ripens each year. That's a lot better way to do it because it takes into account your specific location.
But physically, what are the tip-offs to apple ripeness? What should folks visually look for?
So one of the things is just flesh color. In other words, cut that apple in two. If there's any green tinge to that inner flesh, it's not ready. You know that is still too immature. Sometimes if you can't see that, if you've got a very thin slice, it may be a little bit easier to see that way. Second thing is seed color. If those seeds are white, it's not mature enough. They should be a good brown color. With apples, you normally have 5 seeds per apple. And then also the color change. Now, when you're not talking just about the outside of that apple, what you're really looking at is the color right around the stem. That is going to be either, green, or it's going to be more green than anything until it starts to get mature. When it starts to get mature, even with red apples, it'll turn a tan color. And even with yellow apples, it'll turn a tan color. So look right around that stem. When it turns tan, you know it's getting close. And so the last thing, of course, is flavor. When you think you've got a mature apple, just give it a taste. If it tastes right, you're ready to pick. If it has a starchy color, you're way too early. And so that'll give you an idea. And as I said, keep track of that so that you know from one year to the next when to really start looking for those ripe apples.
It's been an awfully wet growing season. Will folks see some irregularities, maybe disease taking hold?
Yeah, there's a couple of summer diseases that we've seen. And there is one rot disease. It's called brown rot. And if you have anything that's broken the skin of that apple, you may very well see that. Very common on peaches, not as common on apples, but it does get it. But two that you're likely to see are sooty blotch and fly speck if you haven't been on a spray program. So sooty blotch looks like a sooty area on the fruit itself, and fly speck looks like tiny little black specks on the skin of that fruit. Now, these are primarily just aesthetic. In other words, they are not going to affect how that apple tastes or really any of the qualities of that apple. As a matter of fact, you can wipe them off. It's not easy. You have to use some elbow grease, but you can wipe those off. But if you're on a spray program, you probably won't see either one. This year, because it's so wet, they're likely if you didn't spray.
Once more, though, you can salvage those apples. They're not compromised in any way. Just tidy them up. Pears, they're a different story. For one would want to let those mature off the tree. You might explain, Ward.
That's right. So, all of our other fruits, you want to get them as mature as you can on the tree unless you have other problems. Peaches, we have like green June beetle that can attack them. You may want to pick them a little early. But they're actually a little bit better quality if you can pick them fully ripe. Not with pears. Pears are different. They're the exception to the rule. You want to pick them early. And so what you're looking for is something that still has that greenish color. If you let them turn yellow on a tree, you're probably going to have 2 problems. One is that flesh is going to be gritty. And 2, those pears ripen from the inside out. And so if it's yellow on the outside, when you cut into it, it may be brown and mushy on the inside. And so you can avoid both of those problems by just picking them a little bit early.
So a little bit early means what?
So what you're looking for is a change in the ground color. Ground color just means the actual color of that fruit. If you look closely at a pear, you'll see it has little white specks on it when it's immature. Those are the breathing pores. They're called lenticels. And those will be white, as I said, if it's immature. The rest of the pear is the ground color. So when you look at a pear, the ground color is just what it looks like, okay? So it's going to go from a darker green to a lighter green. You may get a reddish blush on it, that type of thing, but it's not going to be completely yellow. So when you start to get that color change, start working through some of the other things you look for. One of those things are those lenticels I mentioned. They're little white specks when that pear is immature. They'll turn kind of a corky color when that pear is mature enough that you may be able to harvest it. Check for that. So with some varieties, it's a little bit harder to see than others, okay? But often you can tell when those lenticels turn color. And then also just give it a taste again, like you do with the apples. If it's starchy, it's early. You can't pick them when they still taste starchy. When they're ready to pick, they're not going to taste ripe. They're not going to have quite the flavor, but they're not going to taste starchy. The last thing I look at is whether that pear comes off the tree easily. I lift it up, give it a little bit of a turn, and if it's mature enough, it'll usually just come right off. And often you're going to have to go over that tree several times over time in order to get all those pears at the right stage. And so doing all those things will allow those pears to be a much higher quality than if you don't.
And you pick your pears You want to keep them for a while. You would want to refrigerate them, you say, for a set length of time?
Yeah, so if really we've found that if you cool those pears for about 2 weeks, it'll actually further increase the quality of those pears. So if you have the space in your refrigerator, go ahead and stick them in there for a couple weeks. And that will also help minimize any grittiness that may be left and also make them a little bit sweeter. And so that's the last stage in that. Now, you can keep them in longer. Doesn't mean that you have to pull them out. Just remember that when you pull them out, it's going to take them a little while for them to go ahead and mature, usually between 1 and 3 weeks. And that's at about 60 to 65 degrees. So a lot of people just pull them out as they need them and then allow them to go ahead and fully ripen just on the counter.
In any event, Ward, it's time that apple and pear growers start thinking in terms of harvest. Thanks so much for the word right here.
You bet.
Horticulturist Ward Upham, K-State Research and Extension with us. Our time's away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.